There's an image that persists for this condition, or that's the closest language I have for it: a dry riverbed. The sun is relentless, baking the cracked earth where a mighty current once flowed. You look to the distant mountains where snowmelt should have fed this channel, but something diverted it. Not a dam, not a storm. Something subtler. An invisible siphoning, taking the inherent waters, the emotional lifeblood, and redirecting it drop by precious drop to irrigate every other field but your own. This is where the feeling begins. This is the source of the backup option paradox. The persistent sensation of being a secondary option is not an accident of character. In the framework I'm using here, it's a primary symptom of a specific developmental pattern: childhood emotional neglect, or SEN. Not overt abuse, but a chronic, almost undetectable diversion of your primary emotional channel. Early experiences created a blueprint where your own emotional flow was not the main current. It was classified as a tributary, meant to feed the larger, more turbulent rivers of others. The research on early attachment offers a mechanism that, once understood, makes this systemic diversion painfully clear. What the data seems to indicate is that when a child's emotional expressions are routinely met with indifference or redirection to a caregiver's needs, their developing neural pathways don't just learn suppression. They solidify a core operating principle. My internal state is not the primary variable in this system. And if that principle is running in the background, it means that early on, you unconsciously began rerouting your own vital resources, not from a desire to give, but because the primary channel was never designated as yours to begin with. And you feel this in the body. It's the hesitation before you speak in a meeting, the quick, reflexive apology when you haven't done anything wrong. It is the physical sensation of learning to take up less space, an autonomic clenching. That initial rerouting was a brilliant, unconscious survival mechanism, an intelligent response to an environment where needing wasn't safe. That wiring was a necessity. But the critical observation is this: the external environment has likely shifted. Yet, the internal mechanism continues to operate. It persists today, not due to present threats, but because the foundational programming still runs, believing its primary directive is to serve other systems. The original blueprint, once protective, now self-perpetuates. I'm aware this is a lot of analysis for what is, at its core, just a very human habit, but the architecture of it matters. This invisible diversion doesn't just leave your own riverbed dry. It forces the carving of new, shallow channels, what we'll call the Alluvial Fan Strategy, in a desperate search for validation from other landscapes. You learn to spread your emotional energy incredibly wide and shallow, 1,000 tiny streams feeding everyone else's garden, hoping a single drop might splash back. The pattern I've observed, again and again, is that this isn't strength. It isn't generosity. It is the deep, unconscious strategy of someone whose main channel was never recognized. And here is where you feel it. You're looking at your phone. You've sent 3 texts checking in on other people. No one has sent one to you. The screen is dark. This constant diffusion of energy leaves your internal reservoir perpetually low. And when the reservoir is low, you become vulnerable to what the system calls toxic runoff, relationships that feed on your compliance. You find yourself overextending, attracting individuals who are themselves emotionally unavailable, because this dynamic, however painful, feels familiar. It unconsciously reinforces the core belief that you are a secondary option, a placeholder. These connections, in turn, can further deplete and contaminate the system, creating a self-fulfilling, contaminated feedback loop. And then the app closes, and it is just an evening. You make tea or scroll, or do the thing you were going to do anyway, and it's fine, it's always fine. It's 10:47 p.m. You've just finished a long phone call where you mostly listen. There's a tightness in your jaw, a tiredness in your eyes that sleep won't fix. You close the phone, and there's a hollow echo in the room, a silence that is less like peace and more like absence. You notice the profound exhaustion, but you don't name its true source. This is the core insight, and articulating it precisely has been a challenge. I don't have the version that does it exactly right, but here's the closest I've come. What if the feeling of being stuck or second best isn't actually about emptiness? I think that's the misdiagnosis. It's not a lack of value, but an immense unacknowledged hydrostatic pressure. Your emotional waters aren't gone. They are simply held under immense force, trapped behind a psychological dam built by past neglect. This feeling of being a backup option isn't a deficiency. It's a massive, unreleased internal potential. Your true worth isn't low, it's simply undammed. And that's a lot to take in. It happens most often on ordinary evenings, which is almost the point. Recognizing this hydrostatic pressure is the first diagnostic step. You are not a dry riverbed. You are a vast reservoir. The path forward, what we'll call the Watershed Reclamation Protocol, involves actively rechanneling your own powerful flow. This begins by consciously damming the external diversions, setting firm boundaries. This will feel like a seismic shift. People who only valued you as a backup will likely exit your life. That fallout is significant. This is not rejection. It is a necessary recalibration of your system. It is the cost of reclaiming your main channel. You didn't choose the initial diversion, but you are the only one in a position to notice it now. And that is the precise point where meaningful change becomes possible. Next, purifying your internal source means processing the invisible trauma of CEN, acknowledging that chronic emotional invalidation was a real shaping force. This is not about fighting the current, but understanding its historical course. And finally, courageously channeling that released pressure into your own main course, prioritizing your self-worth, taking up space, identifying without apology as the primary variable in the equation of your own life. This protocol requires data. It might be useful to start a systemic recalibration log. Each time a relationship shifts or ends as a result of a new boundary, you log it not as a loss, but as a data point confirming the protocol is working. If any of this was specific enough to matter, you will know what to do with it. You will probably fall back into the old current tomorrow or next week, not because you don't understand this now, because understanding and doing operate at different velocities. And there is a question I don't have an answer to. If the mechanism stopped tomorrow, without effort, without decision, what would you do in the first 10 minutes that you don't do now? The current is waiting.